Well, power and Spider-Man. How do these go together? Well, first, let me talk a little bit about Spider-Man and how Spider-Man came into being. Spider-Man happens to be both of my kids' favorite superhero. They've been looking forward to this week for a while. But Spider-Man was originally created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, and he was created back in August of 1962. He actually appeared in another comic and then wound up getting his own off of that based off of his popularity. But Spider-Man came about because most of the superheroes were geared towards adults. And so what they were trying to do was to get something that would gear more towards the adolescent age and trying to get them to read comics and be interested in superheroes. Really, this whole idea of Spider-Man was so that these adolescents could see an individual, a superhero, dealing with everyday struggles that they would go through in their life, that not everything had to be perfect. In fact, let me read something that Stan Lee said about Spider-Man and why he liked Spider-Man. It was actually one of his favorite creations that he ever had. And this is what he said about why he loves Spider-Man: because he's become the most famous. He's the one who's most like me. Nothing ever turns out 100% okay. He's got a lot of problems, and he does things wrong, and I can relate to that. Well, I think as we hear this Stan Lee quote, many of us can also relate to what Stan Lee is saying. Part of the appeal to Spider-Man is that not everything is perfect, not everything works out, but it's the way that Spider-Man navigates those different situations. There's a part in one of the Spider-Man movies, and that's really where this sermon is coming from, where Spider-Man, Peter Parker, is in the car with his uncle, and as he's in the car, his uncle looks at him and says, "Peter, with great power comes great responsibility." And boy, is that ever correct. With great power comes great responsibility. Oh, it's true for Spider-Man. And it's absolutely true for us. So we took time earlier and we reflected and we celebrated communion. I just want to offer this reminder that God's grace is indeed a type of power. It's a power that we can take with us and that we're designed to take with us. We're not called to celebrate the communion elements and just leave them at the table. No, we're called to take that grace that we experience, the power we experience when we embrace that grace and bring it to other people. Well, let's take a little bit of a look at this passage involving the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, something that we celebrate monthly together. It's about something we celebrate still today. We take time once a month in the Methodist Church to stop and reflect on what this actually means. Now, Matthew's account, the account that we have, it does look very similar to that in Mark chapter 14. But let's go ahead and let's break a couple of these verses down into different sections. First couple of verses are verses 17, 18, and 19. And the phrase, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it was another way referring to the first day of Passover. Passover is something that our Jewish brothers and sisters, they still celebrate. This feast derived its name from the fact that no yeast was used in the bread when they got ready to leave Egypt and they were when they were trying to flee Egypt, and that the angel of death then passed over the doors that had the lamb's blood smeared on it. At the disciples' inquiry, Jesus directed them to a particular man's home in the city, referring to Jerusalem. The disciples have to trust Jesus, that what Jesus says to them is going to be true, that what Jesus says to them is actually going to happen. Now, this man apparently knows who the teacher was, who Jesus was, and would gladly welcome the Messiah into his home. But Jesus' words, "My appointed time is near," indicate that Jesus had awareness of the triumphant completion of his work, that suffering which would begin later on that night after this meal. And the reason why Matthew included these details was to show Jesus' careful preparation for this meal. The king himself was making these arrangements that night. The whole process of this Passover celebration, well, it was generally an elaborate ceremony that took multiple days. The order of the meal, it was carefully prescribed in tradition that had begun nearly 1,500 years before. There was a prayer of thanksgiving that was offered over the first 4 cups of wine. There was a preliminary course of bitter herbs that were eaten. A ceremonial question was asked and answered about the meaning of this meal that they were sitting down to partake in. It's much like when we gather for communion, there's a certain amount of setup that takes place so we can fully be in that moment with each other. In the next couple of verses 20 through 24, in the middle of this meal, Jesus makes a statement, and it shocks the disciples. And Jesus announced that there was a betrayer in the midst of them, and it was met with denial, tinged with self-doubt. They all knew that they were weak, but it was hard for them to conceive that they could actually betray Jesus, the Messiah. But more importantly, that they could betray their friend. Perhaps, maybe as they were gathering, they were thinking that it was some involuntary act of betrayal. But the disciples were beside themselves with sorrow. As Jesus says, he who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. And it indicates that this betrayer will be a close friend who shares the same common bowl with Jesus, who's been journeying with Jesus. It was a particularly treacherous act, since the meal signified a tie between all those who were participating. In the next verse, in verse 25, Judas joins the chorus of denials, and he's hoping that Jesus' answer is surely, "Not I, Rabbi," and that Jesus would respond, No, of course not. But only Matthew, in the passage we have, only Matthew records the direct question and the answer. And this would indicate that Jesus had an idea of Judas's plans. But Jesus' response took Judas' question and turned it into a confession. Yes, it is you, Judas. In verses 26 through 29, Jesus, he shocks the disciples by breaking the order of the centuries-long liturgy and offering the cup of his own blood. Thus Jesus, he rendered the earlier Passover obsolete in comparison to what they were getting ready to celebrate, this brand new ceremony, this brand new tradition, and what we celebrate today called communion. In verse 30, talks about that they sang a hymn before they left. Very Methodist of them. But this hymn, it was probably the second half of the Hallel, which is the part of the prayer that was offered earlier. This is the second part of that. And it's song of praise to the Lord, which was sung at the end of the Passover. Just imagine that they're singing this song of praise as they're getting ready to go to the garden, as Jesus is getting ready to be turned over and betrayed by one of his closest friends. So as we take time, we stop and we reflect, as I talked about this clip of that with great power comes great responsibility. How does this tie into communion, to this passage that we just read? So friends, the point is made to Spiderman. He's very serious when he says this to Peter Parker, that with great power comes great responsibility. And you can see in the clip that Peter Parker doesn't actually initially process it. He just thinks that, he's just talking a bunch of crazy stuff. But it's something that Peter Parker, as Spider-Man, has to wrestle with the rest of the time that he's Spider-Man. And just as Peter Parker and Spider-Man had to wrestle with this idea that with great power comes great responsibility, we have to wrestle with that in our daily lives. See, friends, when you and I experience the communion table, it's a reminder that God has given us grace. It's a reminder of an incredible power that we've been given. But it's a power that we're not called to keep for ourselves. We have the responsibility to share that grace with other people. Friends, God's grace, if you've experienced it, you can agree that God's grace is life-changing, meaning it should alter how you change your life. And if it has truly changed your life, well, you should go and you should share that. When you get something that's incredible, that's a gift, you want to share it with other people. I can't tell you the number of people that tell me I need to get an air fryer just because of the amazing things it does. They can't stop talking about it. Oh, friends, if you've experienced the love and grace that Christ offers, it is indeed powerful. But we have a responsibility to share that with other people. I want to close with a story about Queen Victoria. So when she was younger, they kept trying to put her through all these lessons and rules and the way to be proper out in public. And she never took to it. And the main reason was because she didn't understand why. Why am I going through all this? Why am I doing all of this? She didn't get it. She didn't understand. But once they took time, once they explained to her, you have to do these things because one day you will be queen, her whole attitude changed. She understood that she was going to have this incredible power, that with this incredible power came a great amount of responsibility. Friends, the same is true of us. We're not called to just come into this space to experience communion and go, oh, wow, that was great. Can't wait till next month. The reason why communion is special, the reason why we're solemn during the midst of communion is because we're called to reflect. We're called to remember. We're called to understand. We've been given great power. And with that comes great responsibility. Friends, Peter Parker had to go through it. Spiderman had to go through it. Queen Victoria had to go through it. Friends, so do you. And so do I. Friends, we've been given an incredible gift of grace. May we rise to the occasion this week and deliver our response of graciousness to others. Amen.